Thank you, Alex. And you did some of the hard work for me. I was going to do this whole song and dance where I introduced me and Laura, but I think we can just jump right in.
Well, we could jump straight in, except I think Emily evoked an incident for us. My computer just froze.
Is it? No, it's okay. Hold on.
One second.
Hang on. I'm sure we can figure it out. We've been through this before, although.
Well, could we maybe get some help? Actually?
Yeah. Okay. Okay. I'll go. We could talk to those guys really quick. But wait. Remember that one guy? He poured water on it, and then he had his phone. So do you think we could rip it off our phone?
Yeah, okay.
I don't need water. No. Are you offering me drinks? I'm nervous right now. That's okay. No, my phone's dead. I think I really screwed up here.
Okay. Here, I'll do some audience work. Okay. How many of you, show of hands, are deeply uncomfortable right now?
You're always deeply uncomfortable.
Yeah. That's because having to make trade-off decisions in real time, or having to watch someone make trade-off decisions in real time, especially when there is time pressure, when there's a lot of visibility and a lot of uncertainty into what the outcome actually is, or maybe your reputation is on the line, that is hard. Trade-off decisions are stressful, they are uncomfortable, and they are also inevitable. So what we wanted to do today is we wanted to give you some insight into how trade-off decisions affect your work as site reliability engineers and how to navigate them a little bit better.
Okay, I was actually worried it wouldn't go.
So trade-off decisions are a fact of life in most modern work environments. You are being asked to do more with less. You're being asked to build reliable architecture, but make it flexible, adaptable, and easily maintained, to go fast, but to not break things. And Courtney and I have talked at length about the ways in which trade-off decisions are often misunderstood and misrepresented in software engineering, and what the implications of that are both to the individuals as well as the organizations where they work. And so at their core, trade-off decisions are complex decision problems that often involve multiple overlapping and conflicting objectives. So in this way, that's a perfect example or perfect definition for what happens during an incident response. So we decided to look at those and look more closely at how they influence your job. So first, we started off by looking at how do you define trade-offs. And most definitions of trade-offs include some form of acknowledging the advantageous but conflicting properties. And almost, they are ubiquitous in any kinds of cognitively demanding type work. And so a typical characteristic is that there's no dominant alternative that's going to exist that's going to be better than any of the choices that are in front of you. So while you might be able to eliminate some of the less desirable options, you generally can't maximize several objectives simultaneously. So for example, you obviously can't maximize delivering new features at the same time you're minimizing headcount. You can't maximize velocity while also minimizing risk without some costs being incurred at some point within the organization, within the system. A second aspect of this definition is that these conflicting properties are also interactive. So if you index on one attribute, it's likely to narrow or conversely increase the range of possibilities or the prevalence of another attribute. And what I wanted to call out in this second definition that we've got here is that the authors call it risks of different errors. It's not that you will or you won't have errors in trade-off decisions, it's that you're going to have different kinds of errors. So it's kind of a degraded decision context. And a very important aspect of thinking about trade-off decisions is that they typically are done while under uncertainty, risk, time pressure, and with limited resources. So acknowledging this broader decision context is really important because it influences the way that we think about the people who make them, the kinds of supports that they might need to effectively make them as effectively as possible. And so it's a subtle but non-trivial point, because if we acknowledge that trade-offs are necessary and they are inevitable, then what we talk about, what we reason about, and the decisions that we make in day-to-day operations will help to reorganize and support the ways that those decisions get made. And so we're going to start off by talking a little bit about how we investigated this problem.
Yeah. And I also just have to say, like, whoever, whatever conference chair type people put your talk in front of our talk, well done. Like, that's all I'm going to say. There's a lot of overlap between these topics, as you can imagine. So one of the things that we wanted to start with is noting that there's been a lot of research about trade-off decisions in other domains. So other complex, high-tempo, high-consequence domains, notably things like aviation, healthcare, power plants, those types of things, but honestly, not very much in how we make these kinds of trade-off decisions in software. But we suspect, we have some hunches and some hypotheses that there's a lot of similarities across those. But because there's not much existing yet in our industry, we had to take a bit of a sort of multi-pronged approach involving some of the scene setting with existing incident reports. So we're going to set the scene with what do we know about what you all are telling us about your incidents. And then we went and collected our own data, and we're going to look through the analysis of what that looked like. But our starting point for this is the Void. So the Void is a database of public incident reports. Many of you have probably written ones that are in there. And so it's got over 10,000 of these. I didn't write them. I just went out and hoovered them up and stuck them in a database with some tape and glue. And the goal of when I put this together was in part this. There was no one place where we could collect this kind of information together to look at that, to introspect it, to pull information from it, to pull data from it. Not anecdata, but data from it, to partly just help raise awareness and increase our understanding, to give us common language and terms and references to help make the internet, ideally, a better place. And so this is a little bit of what it looks like. There's the URL there, but you can go in, you can search. There's Slack, there's Twilio, you're all in there. And if you're not, I would love for you to be in there. That's another talk. Okay, so what is in there, like I said, is over 10,000 incidents. I think almost 600 organizations are represented in there now, and it's in a variety of formats, like everything under the sun. So you might have thought, oh, incident reports, like a post-incident report or an RCA or that kind of thing. Those are definitely in there, but we also included things like social media posts, tweets, news articles. There's even, I think, a Q conference talk videos. And the goal here was to take a broader view of incidents in our industry. So not just what do you all see or what do you all know, but how does society at large look at these? Because one of the things we saw from other industries that talk and share this information more, it also does influence public perception, and public perception ultimately plays a role in how software exists in our world, right? And eventually things like legislation or regulation. So that's not really what's important here, but there are lots of little metadata things in there as well. The organization, the data, the incident, all kinds of ways you could categorize and slice and dice. But again, that's for another talk. What we really wanted to look at here was the textual information in these reports. Your words about your lived experiences doing this, right? So we kind of wanted to see what was out there before we dove in and started asking really specific questions around trade-off decisions. Is this a question worth asking? We think so. But what can we find here to help guide future directions or the current direction we wanted to take? We had a hunch there would be limitations. There's lots of limitations to this particular set of data. I don't have time to go into all of them. But if you've ever written an internal incident report and an external incident report, you're already intimately familiar with some of the differences and therefore some of the things that don't show up in public incident reports. So we have to grapple with that a little bit. And then 10,000 incident reports. Anybody here want to read 10,000 incident reports? Raise your hand. You do. Don't even. Okay, you too? Okay, great. You're my people. But we really had to narrow the search space, right? Because we were going to read these. We were going to look at them. We were going to actually spend time. We weren't just going to send them off to ChatGPT and hope and pray, right? So the problem was, the search terms didn't really actually yield much. And I was a little bummed about this, but it actually turns out to be kind of an interesting finding in and of itself. So we started with things like trade-off decisions. Oh, yeah, well, none of you write about those, really, in your incident reports, unless you're Laura Nolan. And so we had to come at this from some different directions. And we actually went and asked people like you, not all of you, I'm sorry. I don't know all of you. But we asked SREs, we asked incident commanders, incident responders, like, when you have to go like pull in legal, what technical things are going on? You know, or like what terms can I use to search through this database to find potential examples of trade-off decisions in the wild? So this is where you see things like rollback, reverting, disabling, data loss. That's a fun one. Turns out people don't write about data loss either, but I get why. And what really came out of this was that not a lot of people talk about trade-off decisions, but a few did pop up. I put links in here if you go back to the slides and you want to find them, but I'm just going to walk you through a few of these. Did I mention Laura Nolan? Is Laura in the audience? Yes, okay, hello. Laura is a wizard of post-incident analysis and write-ups, and this is a canonical one in my opinion, and I write about it all the time, in part because it's a palindromic incident. It happened on 2/22/22. It doesn't matter which. Okay, so I'm just going to highlight the fact that in this incident report, she writes that they knew the throttling would mean that users without booted clients would be unlikely to connect to Slack, but the trade-off was that users who did have booted clients would likely see relatively normal service restored. Now, do we know all the behind the scenes of how that trade-off was made? No, Laura does, and maybe she'll tell us about it someday. But we see the evidence that a trade-off decision was made and that factors had to go into that, and this is the output of that. Facebook, they go down occasionally. I think, did that just happen again recently? This was the one, though, where they had to break into their own data center. Do you all remember this one? And so just on a hunch, I could imagine that an incident where you have to go and break into your own data center probably had some fairly high-level trade-off discussions. We don't know about those in this incident report, but we have a whiff that it happened, and then we have the head of infrastructure saying, the hardening that we did for our security slowed us down, but we believe the trade-off like this is worth it. Increased day-to-day security versus a slower recovery from a hopefully rare event like this. So this is sort of a trade-off decision writ very large. And here's another one. This was Datadog's first really big, I think, global incident about this time of year last year. This one has a lot of words in it, I apologize. But what I like about this one is it says our number one priority was to restore processing of live data. But then it bifurcates from there. Most important, usable live data and alerts are much more valuable than access to historical data. And even among all of the live data, data that is actively monitored or visible on dashboards is more valuable. So they have this insight about their customers that helps them make these kinds of trade-off decisions when they're happening. And then you see evidence of this, of these decisions being passed forward. So in an incident, you might make a quick, and we'll talk more about this because Laura really has some really great data on this. I might make a quick stop the bleeding choice, and then we're going to defer until we understand what's going on later or when we're all less tired to work on that. But you see even further deferring of trade-off decisions, right? They might go into your checklists. They might go into your quarterly planning. Here, this might take the form of having only urgent data accessible and processed in degrading mode. So. Last one, which is also one of my favorite incidents because it's Reddit's Pi Day incident. It happened almost exactly a year ago on March 14th, 2023. And the lore is that the incident lasted for how long? On Pi Day. Anyone? 3 hours and 14 fucking minutes, y'all. Sorry, I swear more than she does, but almost as much as you do. I don't know if that's true or not, but I love that little detail. I don't even care if they made it up. It's great. So this incident report talks about a couple of pieces that don't always show up. We were running low on constructive ideas, and the outage had gone on for over 2 hours at this point. Is anybody having Emily like PTSD yet? No? It was time to make the hard call. We would make the restore from backup. Godspeed, right? So all of these things they decide to do, and they're happy with some of this because we wouldn't have to deal with the long reconciliation after the control plane with backup. Technical details. But This incident report gives you a glimpse into the emotional, stressful, social kinds of impacts that, again, I feel like we're going to do this all day, but hearkening back to Dr. Maslach's talk, impact the type of work we do. And those are parts inherently of trade-off decisions, right? So the negative result of my analysis from the void was that organizations don't tend to discuss or present trade-off decisions in public incident reports. And this is probably due to a number of factors, because there are trade-offs about talking about trade-offs. So I talked a little bit earlier about the purposes of internal versus external incident reports. Now, most of you might think, nobody out there needs to hear about how we make trade-off decisions. We did this internally. We did all this great work, it's done, and now, ta-da, here's how we solved it, right? We want to know. Well, we especially want to know. It's a little selfish, right? But it turns out that if you share this information, you are giving other organizations, you're normalizing this behavior that Emily talked about talking about the process of solving these things and not just the technical processes, right? These discussions are happening internally. We know they are, we haven't seen it, and we still don't really see it in the void. So, keeping that in mind, we had to go and triangulate some of our methods. And Laura is going to tell us about the sort of vignette scenario, super cool stuff that came after.
So there's some very real issues organizationally, politically, economically, why organizations don't necessarily air their dirty laundry around trade-off decisions. And some of those same kind of barriers exist when we start to think about how do we unlock the black box of cognition, if it were. Because it's kind of tricky to get inside the heads of software engineers to examine these trade-off decisions. And it's not really as easy as just asking someone, how do you make your decisions?
Why did you have oatmeal this morning?
Because experts are actually not that good at explaining their reasoning. As you get better and better, you develop your expertise, you minimize the existence of and the value of subtle and nuanced parts of how you think your way through different aspects of your work. And so some parts of those cognitive processes are not actually accessible to you as an expert. And so you have to elicit them or observe them externally. And so our approach here to try and get at this was to use scenarios and some cognitive probes to make inferences about these cognitive processes that were going on. And so vignettes are like a form of qualitative research methods that requires participants to analyze a scenario through their own knowledge and experience, which helps us kind of simulate that real world decision context. And so it's a lot like a tabletop exercise for decision making, and it helped us look very broadly at site reliability engineering decisions, trade-off decisions, and both at the individual contributor level, at the engineering manager level, and at the senior management level. And so we look not only at how they individually make decisions, but how they collectively balance those trade-offs. And so the cognitive probes that we use, which is just basically a fancy way of saying really targeted questions, are designed to kind of pull out some of those thought processes. And qualitative data, it can be very messy and unstructured. And so using thematic analysis gives us a bit more of a flexible process to be able to identify and analyze and look at these sort of patterns that start to occur when people use a whole lot of words to describe something that's going on within their heads. And so through each of the series of questions that we asked, we coded the responses to be able to see these patterns that come out. And so by now, we walked through these kind of research questions, we assigned the codes, we looked at the themes, and then we elicited those patterns, and we kind of looked at those relatives to the questions that we asked. And so you might be thinking like, well, how did you actually do this? What was the questions? What was this incident that you were able to spring on unsuspecting participants? So I'm going to walk you through it, the high level right now. And I know that you're all probably deeply curious about this, so we will drop a link to the full vignette at the end of the presentation.
It's not real, though. It's real close.
Well, it's actually built on a hybrid of many events that can reasonably happen in real world, real life growing organizations with multiple services and teams. And the incident unfolds over a course of several days, and it's due to a series of very reasonable solutions to problems that unexpectedly clash with other parts of a larger organization. This is probably something you have experienced before in the past. And so in this scenario, regulations that are outside the control of the organization are forcing the deprecation of older internal APIs for privacy reasons. And as the deprecation period moves on, fields and data provided by the API get redacted. Brownouts are added for weeks so that you can let unaware people know that they're on a deprecated API until one day it's disabled entirely. And so the first phase of this incident begins once the API is turned off, because a core service and that many other teams depend on fails. And it had accidentally survived through the brownout period by using a cache that hid the failures, but up to then had kept it up to date via retries. And so turning the API off fully overcomes these defensive measures, and the failures start to cascade. And so in the incident, it's initially handled by restoring the old API and asking the core service to refresh its cache with the redacted data, which seems to work. So at this point in time in the vignette, the participants go through a series of questions.
Do we ask them what we think the severity is? We didn't do that,
absolutely do not. So the second phase begins when marketing material goes out a few hours later with the non-redacted data that it really shouldn't have used. And as it turns out, there's a weird interplay in how data was redacted without editing timestamps, which meant that the cache wouldn't properly invalidate or refresh itself. So basically, the redaction never took, and service was restored with full data in breach of the law. So this part of the incident eventually gets addressed, which leads us to the third phase of the incident.
We're not done yet, y'all.
So in this one, people notice that other services that were still allowed to access the private data start failing. And instead of valid data, they were using invalid redacted data. So the investigation reveals that the deprecation brownouts intended to help the migration made some teams migrate to the old core service with a bad cache because it provided the same data with more stability. And when the redaction propagated, legitimate uses of the data were lost. And so the actions intended to make the migration safer and to resolve incidents with the least impact possible has compounded to now make this even more challenging. So the questions that we were asking throughout each of these phases were kind of targeted around the key themes that we wanted to understand. We wanted to see considerations across time to see what factors are immediately relevant to the different levels of the organization, which ones get minimized or discounted over time, and which factors actually endure so that we can look at prioritization and discounting. Questions about recruitment are primarily aimed at understanding what information is deemed important, at what points in time, and who has that level of expertise, access, or knowledge. And the recruitment actually tells us kind of how readily can the organization bring this expertise to bear under time pressure and when there's a lot of uncertainty about what's going on. And similarly, when we look at engaging relevant parties, it can tell us about coordination across these organizational boundaries.
Oh, you have to talk to people? Is that the...
You do. Mitigating and minimizing risks is, of course, a central aspect of incident response. And so we focused on questions that help to bring out the ways in which participants were controlling for different risks, especially as that incident progressed and kind of cascaded. And of course, uncertainty persisted and surprise occurred. And so we had some questions that were sort of looking at how did people cope with and handle that. And so we had 27 participants who took the survey, which took about 40 to 60 minutes to complete. We had VPs of technologies, CISOs, distinguished engineers, engineering managers, staff engineers, software engineers, a wide variety of roles that took the survey. Kind of skewed a bit more heavily towards the individual contributors, but still some good representation from the management realms there. So let's talk a little bit about what we found. There were 7 kind of key findings that came out, and I'm going to present them each by starting with sort of the general pattern of what we found, and then instantiate that with some of the quotes and some of the data from the research. And so the first key finding, thank you, Captain Obvious, I'm glad you did this research.
And we're done.
Is that decision-making trade-off decision-making in incidents is complex. And so in this vignette, yes, we created this incident that had multiple simultaneously active goals, deprecating the API, meeting the new privacy requirements, avoid, disrupting work in progress, minimizing customer impact. It required the participants to do what happens in almost every incident, which is to shift back and forth between the goals, to weigh them against one another, to at times choose the least terrible option. We forced them at some point to abandon a potentially viable option in favor of another. And we deliberately underspecified certain aspects of the incident, so they had to grapple with uncertainty. In fact, one of the participants came to find me the other day and said, like, oh, I took the survey, but I just have to tell you, it depends. There's a lot of things that would. He
was like, oh, he had to get that off his chest.
Yeah, and I was like, of course. I was like, that's what we want to see. Is we want to see how do you handle the fact that there is a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot that you're not going to know. And we had a lot of participants say things like, oh man, this scenario sounds painfully common. The situation's such a mess. I've been there. And so in other words, we actually reflected back the realities of trade-off decisions. And so in looking at making the statement that incident trade-off decisions are pretty complex, we coded 23 different factors that were being considered across the 3 different levels. And so we expected to see a lot of factors relating to the technical nature of the incident, the mechanism of the failure, the implications on like system performance and any kind of potential dependencies. And we certainly did see that, but we were also struck by the extent to which they identified organizational factors, such as, well, how do you brief legal if they don't understand what's going on? How to identify people who could help us assess the full scope in far reaches of the organization, unanticipated dependencies.
I was actually most struck by that. But it made me think of, we were talking about Niall's talk at the beginning, if you all caught that, about how SREs sort of seem to inherently look outward, consider the impacts of the systems that they have on other people. So even though I mitigated my surprise, I guess, when we saw this, because it was like, well, actually, that's kind of part of the job. And so it was an interesting thing to have that pop up in the coding.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's considering this sort of capacity of teams that you're working with or that you're working, to help resolve the incident for, was very prevalent in the data. And where a lot of the complexity actually came in was in this sort of interaction between the technical factors, the organizational factors, and the social factors. And so it's not only about these mechanisms of failure and the efforts that are required to actually bring the system back up, but it's about the coordination, the cooperation, and the consideration that is being given to other parts of the business, to the operating environment, like the regulations. And it's this ability to sort of simulate and imagine and then manage the interpersonal, the organizational, and the sort of social consequences of taking different courses of action. And one of the really important points about this is that many of those organizational and social goals are implicit and unstated within our companies. And these goals often conflict. And so sometimes it's easy to figure out, how to resolve those conflicts, but often it's not. It's that sort of tacit knowledge and that deep understanding that you have from either being in the organization for a long time or being able to pull in the kinds of informations and stories that help you to build up that understanding of these different implicit and unstated goals. So we had not only is the trade-off decision-making complex, but there's also a very emotional aspect as well. A number of the responses we're talking about, anxiety and apprehension as the incident starts to reveal itself. And there's a lot of consideration given to emotional, physical, and mental impacts of the incidents, especially as it started to cascade. And I think that the talk this morning also kind of reinforced this as well. Like, this is where burnout kind of originates, is some of coping with some of these kinds of difficulties. I think I wanted to throw this up here because it was perhaps one of the most colorful responses that I've ever had in 15 years of doing research. And it came from a responder who was reacting to this revelation that the downstream services still had access to the unredacted information and were using it in breach of the law. And they simply wrote, OFAC. So the second factor that they were considering was that the second factor is that they're considered and managed differently across roles and levels within the organization. Again, this is probably a pretty benign statement to be making. And of course, we expected to see some pretty clear horizons of, incident responders, maybe thinking about the more immediate and local consequences, senior management, looking at the horizon and saying our economic, losses are paramount, our reputation is at risk here. And to a certain extent, we did see that. But when we were asked about their initial reactions of what was important to focus on, we were surprised to the degree to which senior leaders actually dug into the mechanisms of failure, both initially as the incident started, what's going on, how is this actually working, and as well as the incident progressed over time. And so we kind of assume that this is likely because in software engineering, unlike other kinds of high consequence decision domains, senior leaders often come up through the ranks, and so they do have that technical proficiency. And so this is actually a very potentially useful attribute that can be used to make trade-off decisions easier, because management sort of speaks the language of the incident itself. Another kind of maybe not so surprising but nicely validating point was the degree to which incident responders were sensitive to larger organizational goals and priorities, even while they were wading into the sort of the diagnostic process and attempts to sort of stop these cascades. So they're thinking about reputation, they're thinking about dependencies in different parts of the organization. So relatedly, the third findings had to do with the extent to which trade-off decisions are inherently cross-boundary. And I mean, software systems are unquestionably interdependent. So again, this one seems a little bit self-evident. But what was interesting is that they cross boundaries, these decisions cross boundaries in a variety of ways. Of course, you need to elicit certain kinds of information to determine the extent of the services that were, relying on the deprecated data. But it's also in how they consider the impacts of their decisions on downstream or indirectly impacted parties. And so, in other words, the trade-off decisions got hard because it wasn't just the local immediate goals of the incident that was being considered, but these sort of ripple effects through the organization and even outside the organization. And so this kind of cross-boundary nature brought out this paradox of decision-making that in order to move forward, you got to bring in these outside perspectives to bear, but they can also slow down or disrupt the incident response. And so it was particularly noticeable when you're bringing in subject matter experts from other parts of the organization, such as with bringing in legal, which almost all the respondents right away said this is something that we need to have. They noted that involving other people while necessary could also entirely change the direction and the requirements of the response. And they didn't have to consider those cross-boundary implications, but it means that the trade-off decision is more likely to have unintended consequences on others, and it's less likely to optimize for these overall organizational goals.
And I think that is something that Emily brought up as well, is that incidents involve more than your incident response team. And there's different, not to quote Niall again, but like different slices and stories of the experiences that we have. And this is sort of really a really nice encapsulation of that in the data.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, we also saw examples of strategies that are used to kind of control for some of these potential barriers or potential detractors. And, the risk of sort of bringing in certain kinds of roles, while necessary, can be mitigated somewhat by keeping executive management out of the room, unless they're sort of there in a very specific capacity.
And the room might be chat too, right? Like, I mean, we saw somebody talk about that. I think it was like, oh, I might side channel legal. I don't know if you have this in another one and I'm getting ahead of here, but like, I think the room is an interesting context in modern incident response, right? And how do you, like, your channel management is a whole thing. We didn't really get into that, but I think it's the room is an interesting space when you have to pull other people in. Yeah, it requires you to explicitly give more context for your trade-off decision, which most of us have experienced this over the last several years. The fourth finding was that knowing more about organizational context increases the focus on anticipation and optimization for others. And so this kind of emerged from the data in a bit of an indirect way, because while the nature of the incident required coordination across multiple parties, it became pretty clear from the level of detail and specificity that having a deeper understanding of the goals and priorities of others, not just in your sort of immediate dependent services, but more farther afield, like in the marketing and the legal department, like having an understanding of their priorities and goals, as well as the potential impacts to their work, were really important. And so if you know that marketing relies on financial data to target their efforts, then your choice of restricting their access to it is going to limit exposure for the business as a whole, but it pushes the consequences of that specific choice right onto that group of people. And so having this deeper sort of contextual knowledge, or in this case, imagining this deeper sort of sense of contextual knowledge, can be used to make the decisions like as good as they can be in a bad situation. And so you might know that marketing actually only needs to access that once a quarter. And if you're already past that point in time, you can make that decision much more quickly and confidently, and without that sort of overhead of needing to bring in all these outside perspectives. So another way that organizational context can help anticipate others' needs came from this suggestion, which was bringing that knowledge into the incident in a way that doesn't trade off on speed of the resolution. So talking about legal, not understanding the technical details, rather than bringing them in. We've all been or seen incidents where you're sitting there and we stop the progression of things to be able to bring someone up to speed. And there's 200 people sitting there waiting for this person to ask their questions. So finding strategies to trade off on kind of bringing that knowledge to bear without trading off on speed. So the organizational dynamics that were definitely at play, this came up a number of different times, is this role of having senior management in the incident response. There's kind of this really delicate balance here of needing that access to authority, to information, to the sort of coordinated benefit of having that person in the room can also kind of mitigate people's ability to talk freely about the risks and benefits of some of the solutions or the scenarios that might play out. And so the point here is not that
not that you shouldn't have management in the room, it's that knowledge of how different roles and different sources of expertise are likely to contribute or detract from efforts in certain contexts or certain cultures, as well as understanding sort of someone's availability and willingness to work together. They're an important part of these like trade-off decisions. And so recognizing under what conditions it would be useful to bring them in, at what points and times, helps you adapt those strategies for different incident contexts as well. So it's kind of funny, there was a little bit of judginess, of like, why wasn't more time taken to get into compliance with the law? Or why did the scream test happen so close to the deadline? Which was understandable. People feel uncomfortable about being in these situations, and they're like, why are we in this situation in the first place? But this framing of sort of assessment of kind of how and why you get into this without thinking about that larger organizational context can also lead people towards judgment and towards blame, which can create that conflict, and it actually detracts from kind of having to negotiate these trade-offs across organizational boundaries. So on the whole, there's a bit of frustration, but on the whole, most of the respondents were focused on kind of finding solutions there. So there were implicit costs that were associated with different decision points, financial, attentional, so on and so forth. Keeping a service down a little bit longer has benefits that you might be able to collect more information about what's going on, but then the customer support people are having to deal with that aspect of kind of working with customers. And so you're really like shifting these costs of these trade-off decisions across these organizational boundaries. One of the other things that I just wanted to touch on very briefly here was kind of interesting, was an interesting aspect around this kind of coordination and recruitment was when we were coding for the types of roles that would be recruited to the incident, both initially and then as things progressed. All levels kind of started out very lightweight and very sparse, and the lines there indicate like where greater than 80% of the people said this is who initially I would bring in. We started to see things like senior management kind of would like suggest piling people into the room much more readily than the incident responders would. And so we think that maybe this is because they are not aware of the time that it takes or like the capabilities of how to bring those people in readily. So they're like, just get everybody in the room. So it's kind of an interesting one from a team perspective of thinking about when and how do you want people to advocate on your behalf. And so the trade-off decisions obviously evolve over time, and we sort of use the incident to capture the inflection points at which sort of changing in approaches or strategies might occur. And so as the event progresses, the priorities are going to change, the possibilities for failure are going to narrow or broaden, and then those actions that are available are going to narrow and broaden. And so we started to see initial responses coping with the immediate consequences that later gave way to sort of considering broader systemic influences in how to mitigate. And so some other factors is as the incident progressed and more information became available, we saw a lot more creativity and a lot broader sort of consideration of, well, can we pay the fines for a while? Can we sort of divert some resources and then think about like how to unravel this over time? And one factor that was kind of interesting was that held kind of consistent across the levels was that the issue of going public, we sort of thought like, oh, this is going to like change people's calculus, but it actually held pretty constant. And most sort of said, we asked about like, why did this or does this change your decision and why? And they said, no, the early recognition that there was sort of a legal violation here kind of set the bar for the incident, not the severity, but set the bar in terms of the mental model about like what was happening and how important was this. So that was kind of an interesting thing. Last point is that some goals and priorities are likely to get trashed along the way. And so this is, I think, for many of you who have a lot of experience in doing this, this will seem like, yes, that is what happens during these events. But I think it's important for the junior people on your team to recognize that you're gonna have to give up on certain things, even if they're really, really important to the organization at other points in time. And so things like, as what we saw was as the awareness of the problem started to grow, the emphasis on economic loss, like violating SLAs or, potential fines, or we can't send out new marketing materials, kind of gave way to this, we have a big problem and it's gonna take a lot of work. So now we have to figure out how to reconfigure everyone's schedules to be able to address this in the least difficult way. And so, those kind of trade-off, the decisions towards the end became less about are my customers unhappy, and more of, are we gonna be on the front page of Hacker News or CNN? So what's the key takeaways here, Courtney?
Gee, thanks, Laura. Everyone's like, hey, that was a lot of researchy talk and words. How do I take this back to my organization and do anything with this? And so I know that Emily didn't want you to take a picture of one of her slides, but I actually want you to please take a picture of this slide. Because partly we're gonna run out of time and I can't talk through all of it, but this actually has recommendations. Let's start recognizing and developing the skill of making trade-off decisions. Let's include those social and organizational trade-off decisions in our game days and our tabletop exercises. Let's acknowledge that those take different perspectives and then we have to practice bringing those people in. We have to go talk to them. You might want to talk to the head of marketing every quarter and have lunch with them, and that's how you know that every quarter is when they send out the reports that require the data that you provide. So on and so forth. This takes practice. We have to invest in it. These are not skills that companies typically do. And it, again, I'm sorry, harkens back to Christine's talk this morning, Dr. Maslach, where we invest in table ergonomics and chair ergonomics, but not social and emotional ergonomics. And this is social and emotional ergonomics. And this is practicing it and figuring out what we need to make these kinds of decisions collectively better together. So that's the 0 mark, but we have just a little bit more. There's 7, so you have to take another picture. I'm sorry, but you're all good at that by now, right? And then you have to merge the picture together. Your 12-year-old will probably help you with that.
I think I'm just gonna jump in here for a second because it's not inconsequential to say the introduction of new language and new concepts to sort of say, this is something worth talking about, whether it is in your incident reviews or whether it is in sort of training materials or onboarding, to be able to help socialize this within the organization, both at the individual contributor level, but also asking management, how would you expect me to handle these kinds of trade-offs?
Yep. This is the mandatory researcher. Here's what wasn't perfect or accurate with our data slide. I'm not gonna get into it too much, but people self-selected into this off of LinkedIn. They were probably interested in this problem, so we probably didn't hear from people who aren't that interested in this problem. Your mileage may vary. There was identification of role by each individual, and then, is the CISO at this organization the same as the CISO there, or as a senior staff engineer, you might be an IC, but you might be a leadership. All those things came into play. And it was kind of long. I mean, dedicating 40 to 60 minutes to this meant we probably sort of skewed towards that individual contributor sort of perspective. So what's next? Well, first of all, we just really wanted to work together. So you all are just having to put up with that. And we wanted to do this for a really long time. But we want to do more research. This was really preliminary. So we want to collect more data. And we want to understand a few things, right? So what is the extent of the information needed to make these kinds of trade-off decisions? When you have to go to legal, what kinds of information might you want to collect before you go and talk to them? Actually starting to map that out and looking at that. To better understand what the goals and priorities and incentives of these kinds of roles are, we'd like to do this more globally, right? We'd like to be able to say this in a more general way across the industry, but we don't know that yet. And honestly, we would love to see people talking and deliberating about their trade-off decisions in their incident debriefing processes. I would love for you to tell us about that and write it up in your public incident reports. I understand that we may not entirely get through to that, but I also, there's a value in participating.
Yeah, absolutely. And collective research efforts, not only what's happening to improve efforts within your organization, but software is running the world, and how do we make these kind of critical digital services safer and more reliable? That kind of needs to be a united group effort. So we're coming to the end here. We would be remiss if we did not acknowledge our colleague, Freddie Bear, for his contributions in helping us make a very devious incident that both excited and terrified the participants. So please stay in touch. We love to hear what you think about this, and if you have any ideas for future work that you'd like to see done. And of course, we have the reference slide, including a link to check out the full vignette if you want to walk through it yourself. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.